Hello, today is Wednesday, July 24th, 2019. This is the standard cluster API office hours, a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. As always, we adhere to a code of conduct policy written down in the CNCF, which basically boils down to don't be a jerk. Given the average attendance of this meeting, which is fairly large, we kind of request that folks use the raise hand feature, which is actually denoted in the top of the document. So if there's following along at home, it's all written down in gory detail. Basically, you go to the participants and you can raise your hand. I'll try to do my best job of moderating. So with all of that preamble, I will get this party started. Jason, you're first up with I'm guessing a PSA on V018.
Yep, that's correct. We had a minor bug fix release for version 0.1.8. So if you're consuming it downstream, please go ahead and update to get the latest fixes.
Just as what's the fix? Just a highlight reel.
Sorry, I'm troubleshooting a GCR bucket issue with Tim Hawkin right now. The biggest fix right now is we were having issues with removing the finalizers at times, which was causing some reconciliation issues. So now we make sure to get the latest cluster object before removing those finalizers.
Right. And this helps with the delete workflow, correct?
That is correct.
All right. Any questions there for Jason? Going once, twice, 3 times. Next, Vince, you have a set of PSAs.
Yes, so the first one is the API group has been finalized and is cluster.x-cates.io. And this came up like in the link they issued, there's a comment about how we came to this. Tim, do you want to speak a little bit about it?
No. It's just that we have to adhere to that now until we want to be, if we want to be a fully supported Cates.io API.
Yeah, so the idea is that like X stands for experimental, I guess, and it's from the golang.org/X, kind of like standard. And for now, like we're experimental API because we're an alpha, but after API review, like we might drop the X and just go do cluster.cates.io. Another PSA is the Bootstrap proposal has been updated. Now there's a new field that it's required and expected, which is called status.ready. It's a Boolean field, which, for example, if you have a Bootstrap or infrastructure provider, its status will be ready, and then the cluster API will understand that that resource has been kind of ready and can proceed to another state. The cluster proposal changes, which has been submitted by Pablo, has been merged last week, I believe, and there's an implementation PR up. Feel free to leave feedback or anything else that you would like to see there.
So I have a question. The first question is with status.ready. This is kind of like an interim until we actually have some formalized states regarding status so that the conditions are not fully formed. So this is basically a catch-all for availability. Is that correct, Andy?
I was just going to say it's not currently an interim. It could evolve into more, but given the Bootstrap provider's job is to produce Bootstrap data, I'm guessing this is probably going to be sufficient for a while at least.
Bootstrap, I'm sorry. Yeah.
We do also have something similar for infrastructure, for both cluster and machine infrastructure. It's just a single ready Boolean, and if needed, we can expand that over time.
Yeah, I'm guessing that you would have a well-defined set of conditions, typed conditions over time, because there's ways to error out. You'd want to know more details of the state of the infra along its transitions.
Yeah, we have talked about it, and we just didn't want to complicate things like right now. But it's definitely something that should be in the backlog for later to discuss.
Okay. Any other questions? Going once, twice, 3 times. Cluster cuddle.
The $1,000,000 question: what should we do with cluster cuddle for V1 Alpha 2? The tool is now provider agnostic, as in it won't work because the bootstrap and infrastructure resources are not pivoted. But in a management cluster, it could work, I guess, or like some alpha phase, it will probably work. So now at least like we'll have one tool for all providers. That said, like there's a lot of work to be done to support V1 Alpha 2. And I know, Tim, you had future plans with the capi operator and like other tools. So I'm wondering like if we should put the work in or not.
What does the community say? I don't know what the folks' reliance is to be, what the reliance is on cluster cuddle from a lot of the different providers. So if you have deep dependencies, now please speak up.
I don't have deep dependencies, but I do have thoughts. I do have thoughts here. I have something very similar in the Docker provider. There's a program I use called capi control that I wrote that does a bunch of helpful commands for management clusters. I don't think it is, it's definitely not agnostic because it is like, it uses kind and it doesn't pivot. But it does a lot of the same things. It would be cool if we could merge this work together, but I don't know if it's the same use case.
So I have longstanding opinions that I would like to deprecate cluster cuddle to fix some of the longstanding UX issues that exist across providers and have a well-defined specification that outlines the user stories that we're trying to aim at to simplify the day one scenario in particular for people who are coming to Cluster API. I am not ready for presenting that. I think it's going to take me at least another week or so to finish that up. But I would be slightly concerned about trying to get that in for V1 Alpha 2 milestone. So this presents a conundrum.
So for V1 Alpha 2 in development, like I personally use cluster cuddle like in 2 cases. Either if like especially for V1 Alpha 1, but for if I want to like spin up a cluster and pivot it with kind, or if I want to have a management cluster, I use some of the alpha phases. And this is like documented in Kappa. So I had 2 ideas. Like either we support the bootstrap and infrastructure resources and we pivot and then we have to add tests for it and all that funny things in cluster cuddle, or we deprecate all the pivot parts and we just say you can run kind of like V1 Alpha 2 in a management cluster, and that's pretty much it. And then we'll rely on like the future plans to actually support a more holistic view for users.
I know that New Relic said that they depended upon it. Is there anyone from New Relic on the call to talk about their usage of cluster cuddle and pivoting? No one really. So maybe we should open up an issue and then blast the mailing list, because I'm super surprised that people aren't more vocal on this. Open up an issue about the problem and potentially send that issue to the mailing list to solicit options here. Because I do know that people do depend upon it, and I do know that they depend upon pivoting because I asked that question. So I want to get broader feedback. Pablo, your hand's up.
It will be probably interesting to comment on the future plans, but for me are not clear. I mean, the idea that we're creating, understand the problem maintaining the tool, but as we mentioned a couple of times that considering the future plans we have for more holistic solution from the user experience, I think that was what being said. But I'm not totally aware of which plans though. So probably in this issue, if you document or comment what will be the alternative in the future, it will be easier for the community to consider the two options.
That's fair. I should probably get that in line along the way. Maybe we can open the issue now to talk about the current problem that we face with V1 Alpha 2. And then for next week, I should hope, next week I should have a more concrete document and stubbed out idea in place. I've talked about it informally with other folks. I'm not ready for broader presentation because it would require more time talking than it would if I had a document to go along with it. So I think we could probably present the issue that we currently face with V1 Alpha 2 and Cluster Cuddle as a standalone thing, and then present the other option as the alternative approach and write it as the proposal as a separate thing.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Pablo, your next step.
Just a brief comment. I've noticed that sometimes, or it's quite frequent, that we have some pull requests that have one single commit with hundreds of files which are changed. For instance, sometimes there are some changes that are not strictly speaking related to the objective of the pull request, but are probably needed, so refactoring, something like that. And that makes it extremely hard to make the review, because it's hard to find which files to review in terms of the pull request itself. So I don't know if we could, is this policy on the group, on the community, to only one commit per pull request? Or we can adopt a more flexible that if there are some non-related or non-essential changes related to the pull request objective, to put it in a separate commit or multiple commits. For instance, vendoring, stuff like that, are very big and are impossible to review.
There is a general policy that actually exists upstream that promotes what makes a good pull request, that promotes that each change should be isolated. So I would recommend that you should not be doing refactoring in a vendor pull request, just period, unless it's absolutely necessary to make that PR fly. And if you do that change, that it should be a separate commit message. And that's typical, that's actually documented in what makes a good pull request. And that's in the main KK repository. And we should be following those best practices because it makes it much easier on the reviewer, because we've had these problems in the past in KK. Of trying to figure out what was the change you made versus what is this monstrosity of dependencies that exists inside your PR. So I agree with that statement. We should be following that. I have not been watching the pull requests fly by if there was something that was smashed. But if you see something, please comment on the pull request and maybe put a hold message on it to make sure that we keep each other honest. Andy, you're next.
Two things. So yeah, we generally don't try to open giant pull requests that mishmash vendor changes with everything else in a single commit. If you do see it, it was probably accidental. And the second thing is that while this is good for pull request reviews to have separate commits, we currently only do squash merges when stuff gets merged in this project, which makes it hard to look at things after the fact if you're trying to look in Git history. So I'm wondering if maybe we want to consider possibly not squashing when merging.
So something that I brought to Fabio in the VMware SWAC is that if you enable squash on a repository, it can nuke committer identity, such as...
Yes. Yeah, I noticed that happened to me because I had my default email with GitHub set to my personal Gmail, and I started looking at commits of mine that had been merged and noticed that it was not my VMware email address, which surprised me. So I don't know if we need to open up an issue and do lazy consensus or whatnot on this, but I'm definitely in favor of switching to not doing the squash merges.
Jason?
Yeah, I'll second that as well. It's also caused us pain with doing any type of backports as well, because the squash merges then merge those backports, and then you don't have kind of a clean way to do backports from that point on. So while we shouldn't necessarily be advocating for backports, but it's just another data point.
Right. Why don't we open up an issue and then talk with the test info folks about making the change. Are there any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns? It seems like there's broad consensus that yes to what you're saying, Pablo, in general, as well as yes, we also need to fix the tooling that smashes everything together. Any other comments?
Quickly, a PR should be an umbrella for basically a batch of commits. So if your commits are in the scope of the PR, they should be part of the PR. But if some one of the commits goes outside of scope of the title, the definition of the PR, it should be a separate PR. That's how it works.
Yes. Yeah, and this is all documented in the what makes a good PR in the main KK repository. Next up, Andy?
Yes, so I would say this is probably the last week to get in your responses for the face-to-face meeting survey if you haven't already. The link is in the meeting agenda on the screen, and it looks like either the week of September 16th or September 23rd have the most people who are available. I think they just vary by one at this point. I think that the week of the 16th is probably better just because it's a week earlier. And if we manage to make our August 31st estimated date for V1 Alpha 2, which I'm optimistic that we'll do, then having a face-to-face to plan V1 Alpha 3 sooner would be better. So again, please fill this out. And we are investigating logistics right now for the week of September 16th in San Francisco. And I will have a follow-up probably later this week or early next week with some additional information. But for right now, I'm planning on using the responses to track who's planning on attending. So if you haven't, please fill it out. Thanks.
I do recall that there was a request to have something that allowed folks to justify this to their management chain. Do you have that available or a link to that? So people
I still need to do that. Thank you for reminding me.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Going once, twice, 3 times. Well, that is great. I hope to see everyone there. This would be awesome if we can get a face-to-face and do a little bit more concrete planning. We're all locked in the room. I will try my best to arbitrate without folks descending into violence. I know that we want to get a lot of stuff done in a short period of time, so we'll see. We'll do our best. Daniel, you have the next topic.
Yeah. So I noticed that I was looking into something, and I noticed that the add-ons that are deployed once the capi controllers are able to reach the workload cluster's API server. And for my particular use case, I actually want to be able to deploy something that enables that to happen. So if the workload cluster happens to be in a restricted network environment, and one way to deploy this the solution is on the cluster itself as an add-on, but there's this chicken and egg problem. Haven't filed an issue. I just wanted to see if there are any strong feelings, whether that's something that we could potentially do.
My intuition tells me that this is a hot take. I haven't looked into detail about your condition is, but my intuition tells me that this could be part of the Bootstrap controller for customization, potentially, especially for the control plane for deploying an add-on. That's my current thinking. I don't know if others have thoughts there.
Chuck, Andy, I'm happy to file an issue. I don't know if on the kubeadm Bootstrapper repo, for example.
So I'm thinking about this one. The Bootstrap provider is going to operate before the infrastructure for your server or virtual machine is provisioned. So, and then like there's nothing stopping it from doing additional work after, but the general purpose of a Bootstrap provider is just to generate the Bootstrap data. So are you thinking about the CNI or more than the CNI for this use case?
Pretty much on that level. It could be, yeah, it could be CNI. I mean, I'm thinking of just deploying a client in a pod. It wouldn't necessarily need CNI, but it doesn't seem like a terrible idea to have CNI.
Well, so the reason I ask about CNI is that that's required for a node to be considered ready. So so you can start the control plane without CNI installed and set up. And so your control plane, you can interact with it, but you can't really create any pods. You could certainly have static pods that the Bootstrap provider maybe created to do some add-ons. So I think maybe let's file an issue in capi and have a discussion there, and then we can try and figure out, does this make sense in capi? Does it make sense in a Bootstrap provider? And just have that follow-up conversation in GitHub.
Thanks.
Are there other questions, comments, complaints, concerns there? Going once, twice, 3 times. Next up, there are no more agenda items, so I'll pause here for a second to make sure there's any. Are there any other last agenda items that folks want to discuss before I hand it over to Andy for issue triage? Bueller. All right, I'll stop sharing my screen. Andy, it's all you.
Alrighty, there we go. It doesn't look like we have much that's new. So we have something that we already talked about, which is update cluster cuddle for v1 alpha 2. So Tim, do you want this one?
Yay. Can you leave it as help wanted, but you can assign me, but there's still help wanted. And you can leave it for v1 alpha 2 until we can figure out a plan.
Okay. I'll stick you in there and we'll get the cluster cuddle. All right. The other one, I believe, was something that I added this morning, which is something that I would like to see fixed in 0.1 or v1 alpha 1, because we've already made this change in master. So this is where machine sets, machine deployments, and machines, there's code that doesn't always set the cluster owner reference if the cluster exists. And we had some discussion back and forth this morning about, in addition, or a slight clarification is that if you don't have an owner reference, so if you were to create a machine set that didn't belong to a machine deployment, for example, it should have a cluster owner reference. But if you did create a machine set that belonged to a machine deployment, then it should just have the machine deployment owner reference. And hopefully this won't be too controversial. It's a slight change to v1 alpha 1 behavior, but it'll get picked up on an upgrade when you deploy the new version. And this will help with cluster deletion, because right now, if you look at 985, if you have a cluster actuator that's doing a delete, and that all happens in the foreground as part of the finalization of the cluster deletion, if there's dependencies that need to be deleted first, like machines for the AWS provider, you end up in this endless loop where the cluster is trying to delete something, say a VPC, but because the machine still exists, it won't. It'll fail, and the machine won't get deleted as part of the deletion flow unless we put logic in to make that happen. So I think this will just help provide more stability around deletions. I believe, and we're going to try and do this for a 0.1 release shortly. And I don't think we have anything else that we have not triaged. Anybody have any other comments, questions on the open issues?
One thing that might be beneficial, and I don't know if we want to do this or modify the format going forwards, but because these other repositories kind of fall under the umbrella of the release products for V1 Alpha 2, we might want to go through their backlog as well. In particular, the Bootstrapper is the main preeminent thing for V1 Alpha 2 release.
Yep.
I don't know what the current, if folks have a bead on the current status of that.
I am happy to give an update there if necessary.
Please do.
Yeah, so right now we being, I think Amy and myself are the two people who are working on that the most right now. We are implementing the controller logic for the config. And while that's going fine, before I do that, I do want to get the Docker provider up to use V1 Alpha 2 so I can actually test what's going on without having to use AWS resources, but it's all fine. Like it's going well. If we want to go for the backlog though, I think there is some interesting stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff that's out of scope in the issues list right now. Yeah, the interesting part about this whole process is the stuff that we were automating before some of the stuff is no longer like able to be automated. Like there's an additional step in the user experience. The user creates a machine and then creates a kubeadm cluster bootstrap config or kubeadm cluster config. And they have to manually enter some of the data there instead of before where the Kappa provider was aware of the whole system. Now the Bootstrap provider is just aware of a small subsection of the system, so it doesn't see all the things that it may need to see. So we're working on figuring out how to make that experience a little bit nicer. One of the interesting parts is how to manage certificates. So we decided recently, I think this week, that we were going to put that into the Bootstrap provider is going to, for now, be managing certificates of a cluster. And if a user wants to override them, they can create a secret with the custom certificates that they have. And if they don't want to, then kubeadm Bootstrap will create the secrets for them. But right now, there's not a ton of work beyond sort of like just implementing the controller. But I would be happy to walk through all of the open issues. There are not that many of them.
I would like to talk about this one, Chuck, the cloud init. So,
oh, yeah, okay.
The summary on this one is that by chance and luck, the version of cloud init that we're using in the AWS provider is a fork of the cloud init source code repository that happens to have templating. And the templating is needed so that we can pull data from the instance metadata and use that for things like host name or IP address. So this works in Ubuntu because they have a new enough version of Cloud Init, but Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL look to be on either version 17 or an older version of 18. And I'm wondering if anybody from Red Hat, so I think Michael, if you're still here, I don't know if he is. I was just wondering if there's anybody from Red Hat who potentially could help us get the version updated, or at least have a discussion. But I think Michael left. So yeah, we can table that. I'll ping some more people offline.
So I guess one of my asks maybe for next time, Chuck, would be if you have items that you could federate out to the larger group or people that want to engage, which I'm sure there are many, maybe 100 people, there's 30 people, to get to some more granularity in the backlog so that way you can federate out some of the work and get a help wanted list. Because I'm sure there's aspects to this, especially testing, where somebody could probably start engaging earlier and it'd just be better for your sanity to get those folks.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah, I can work on building up some of this work for next meeting.
Are there any other repositories that we should consider for next time to walk through? There's so many providers that I don't know if it makes sense or if we want to evaluate or walk through or potentially do a triage for V1 Alpha 2. I'll leave that up to the group and maybe talk about that as a potential item that we want to discuss. Like it might be beneficial, at least if we have extra time on the meeting to talk about, hey, you're going to have to refactor this whole chunk of code because V1 Alpha 2 is coming.
So is there an infrastructure provider that we're going to ship as the default, or is there not going to be one? Because I would consider that to be part of the V1 Alpha 2 release, as you can't really do anything without an infrastructure provider.
I would like to see, and we're planning to have Kappa ship at the same time. And, this is the meeting to make decisions around when others can align on getting V1 Alpha 2 out the door. So if Cap V and Cap Z can do it as well, that'd be great. If there's others that want to come in line too, that'd be awesome. And if there are some that aren't from, say, the big three cloud providers who maybe need some guidance with how to implement either the infrastructure provider, or if they need a custom Bootstrap provider, please come find us in Slack or set up a Zoom meeting so that we can help you out.
I'll be more explicit and blunt. Justin, how is Google and GCP going for V1 Alpha 2?
I have not looked. We will take a look. I mean, I have a bunch of PRs. I have not cycled around on that.
If you need help, how does your backlog look for people just kind of jumping in?
That would be very welcome.
Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns about V1 Alpha 2 components deliverables?
I have a new, different topic once we're done with this one that I just remembered.
Is Cap D ready for V1 Alpha 2?
It's not. We're working on that at the moment.
Yeah, it could be great as a default infrastructure provider because, everyone has Docker. So
yeah, that'd be really cool. I was actually thinking about having a meeting for that because there's an awful lot of work there and the backlog is a little bit better groomed and trimmed down. So maybe I'll set up a meeting for that.
Also, while we're at it, does CapD support multi-master clusters?
Yes.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Now, the real turducken question is, does it support multi-clusters?
It should support multi-clusters. Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, it gets weird.
You mean like nested clusters?
Well, if you had a management layer, if you wanted to have many clusters through a management control plane.
I mean, yeah, that's fine, but you could, I don't think you could run a cluster inside of a cluster. But I'm not 100% sure on that. But yes, if you run a management cluster and then you can create as many additional clusters as you like, assuming that your host machine has enough resources to run those clusters.
We have to go back to kubeadm and allow configuring multiple administrator users. Currently, everything is bound to admin. So you have to apply some modifications to allow multiple clusters to be controlled from the same location. But yeah, if you have the resources, you can create as many clusters if you as you like, but you have to have the same client that can modify them.
Are there any other questions with regards to V1 Alpha 2 and associated providers and deliverables? Going once, twice, 3 times. Back
Thanks,
to
Tim.
Andy.
Justin, I have a question for you about the PR that you have opened to make the cordon and drain library more usable. Is that something that you'll be able to pursue? Have you talked to anybody about going forward?
If we like that, I'm happy to do that. I think we should. It's currently in 6 CLI, which feels a bit like a graveyard for PRs. So I think we should take it into SIG cluster lifecycle ownership and just approve it ourselves. And because I'm sure there'll be other changes we want to make to the drain functionality, and then we should grab that so that we can actually iterate on it if we want to be in KK.
Yeah, I mean,
But
ultimately, it would be nice to, I don't know, move it to client Go or something, or some sort of install thing, because it's easier to use if it's not in KK, right?
Agreed. Yeah. So I think if we like it, we should decide if we like it and we want that functionality to exist in a shared location, and then we should extract it and move it in probably 2 steps. The first step of which I've done like the 80% of in the classic 80-20 rule.
I give a +1 to my Go.
I'm sorry, to what?
To moving to client Go.
Oh, to client Go. Thank you.
Are you talking about the PR from me? Ilya?
I think Ilya did the initial start of this work, and I don't think he has an open PR that finishes it, so I put a PR up that like extracted out the remaining functionality.
I see. So you're replacing
his PR merge, and then I do more of like extract out more functionality to be more reusable.
I see. Okay.
All right. Well, I definitely would like to proceed with this. So I think we can get final reviews and then go shopping for owner approval. But this will be really helpful to anybody who needs to delete a machine.
Are there any other last issues that folks wanted to discuss? Or do we get whopping 20 minutes back? Whoa.
Sorry, not quite 20 minutes. We have kind of a question around pivoting and for V1 Alpha 2, and if there's a way we can help make that real, like with the operator pattern.
So the comment we made earlier, I think I was looking for you too, but I don't know if you were online. The comment we made earlier is that there's a large refactoring amount of work that needs to be done for cluster cuddle. And the question we had was whether or not we wanted to move to the new world order that I've been sketching out on dry erase boards. But it's not ready for broader consumption yet. But maybe I can sync with you two in particular offline. We can figure out a path forward, or anyone else who's interested. We can do it on the Capi channel and try to get some traction there. But the more the merrier. Right now, we're trying to spec out sort of a different user experience workflow that cuts across providers that's consistent. I think we have a solid workflow for how we want this to work, but the logistics are many and thorny, so more help would be definitely welcome.
Awesome.
Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Going once, twice.
Hey, Tim, this is Sudeep here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just have a general, basic question. I'm just starting up in the cluster API, so still maybe I have to catch up on many things. But the question is related to one of the use case that I see, multi-tenancy management. like, using this, we can build a management cluster and a workload cluster, and it is also related to the multi-tenancy working group I was getting involved with. I just wanted to know, like, is there any further details on this? Like, if I'm trying to learn it by doing, is there a way I can like do it somehow or
So
something different? Yeah.
from a high level perspective, Cluster API doesn't take opinions on sort of the potential user stories around it. We just enable the infrastructure for people to do the different user stories. So like, especially with regards to multi-tenancy and specific deployment policies, those are, we kind of consider those out of scope because it's fractal, right? It depends almost entirely upon your environment and how you want to manage these things. I'm sure some people will have some best practices and some people have highly opinionated versions that differ from those best practices. So as a result, Cluster API itself does not usually take a stance there. We create the guns. Other people do what they want with them.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So, I mean, it should probably be taken up in the multi-tenancy SIG if they can come out with this, right? Utilizing Cluster API.
Yeah. So if they have a specific set of best practices that they want to recommend for multi-tenancy, then more power to them on how they want to deploy. But that's like we don't take a stance in that particular area. Usually the scope statement for Cluster API is really bounded. Otherwise, there's this weird problem we could have where like where does it end, right?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions? Going once. I got through 2 last time. I'll count slower. Going twice. Going 3 times. Sold. All right, we end 17 minutes early. Happy Wednesday. Take care, everybody.